Because each one of them, when you look at their names, Bozez means glittery and Sina means thorny, and we can go into a whole thing and talking about how as you follow God, there are going to be glittery rewards and thorny adversaries that you have to pass. But tonight what I want to do is I want to look at something that is super simple. And I believe that it's three things that we see Jonathan has and does as he faces overwhelming odds. Because I think all of us in here, we would say that as we looked out at 30,000 and 6,000 and more soldiers that could ever be counting, that would be an overwhelming moment. So for all of us that have faced an overwhelming moment, for all of those that will ever face an overwhelming moment, what do we do? What do you do in that moment? So if you're taking notes, here's the first thing. Here's the first thing that I want you to notice that Jonathan did. Jonathan took action. Jonathan took action. You see, I think it would have been very easy for Jonathan in that moment to sit back and look at the whole circumstance and look at all the different situations that he was facing and all those different warriors and all those different chariots and look back at his dudes with like sticks and rocks and be like, I'm not going to do anything. I'm just going to see how this plays out. I'm not going to move. We're just going to see maybe if we pretend that they're not there, they'll go away. Guys, be quiet. They won't know that we're here. But Jonathan doesn't do that. Jonathan takes action. So why is it so many times that when we face overwhelming circumstances or overwhelming moments in our lives, that the action that we take is inaction? Why is it that when we face moments and we face these situations and we have these times that what we do is we freeze? That we end up not doing anything because we're not sure of what to do, so we just stop. I know a lot of people that have been stopped for the past 10 to 15 years. I know a lot of people who were stuck in the place that they were in college and in high school because they faced an overwhelming situation or they faced an overwhelming choice, and their solution was, I'm just not going to do anything. I'm just going to act like it's not there, and maybe it'll go away. Or if I wait, how many of you done this? If I wait long enough, maybe the decision will make itself for me. Anybody in here? Am I preaching to the choir? Just me? I'm the only screwed up one in here? All right, cool. Yes. Or we just ignore it. Let me tell you why in college I drank and did drugs. Because I didn't want to deal with the situations and the overwhelming circumstances that I had created for myself. So it was easier for me to go out and get hammered on a Friday night so I didn't have to deal with the choices that I made on Thursday night. How many of us freeze? How many of us stop if you're honest with yourself? How many of you have faced these overwhelming moments and you just haven't done anything? You've just going to see what this I'm just going to see how this plays out. Are you going to try to get? No, I'm just going to see how it plays out. We freeze. We stop or we ignore it like it's not there. Listen, just because you ignore something doesn't mean it's not there. You're eventually going to have to deal with it. You're eventually going to have to face that thing that's overwhelming to you. I mean, we would think Jonathan's an idiot if that's what we read. And Jonathan saw that there were 30,000 chariots and 6,000 charioteers and more men that he could count, and Jonathan pretended that none of them were there. We would all be like, what the crap? Like, what's wrong with this guy? But what we see is Jonathan take action. Now listen, I don't think that it was a blind action that Jonathan took. I don't think that Jonathan and his armor bearer were sitting by the pomegranate tree and they were just bored and Jonathan looks at his armor bearer and says, hey bro, you wanna go pick a fight? I don't think that it was because of the lack of anything. You see what I think happened was, I think that Jonathan remembered some of the promises of God. And so because Jonathan remembered the promises of God, Jonathan allowed the promises of God to move him to action. See, listen to me. Action without promises is presumption and not faith. I think Jonathan, as he looked at his armor bearer and said, hey bro, let's go over there to that outpost, that he was remembering the promises of God, that he was remembering the things that the Bible spoke about, that he was remembering the old stories of the battles that he had heard and how God was on their side because they were God's chosen people. I believe that Jonathan was recalling some of the promises of God. So let me ask you, Sub30, what would it look like for you? If you looked at your overwhelming circumstance, if you looked at your overwhelming situation and you looked at it in the light of the promises of God, what would it look like? If you looked at that thing that is keeping you back, that you looked at that thing that you're saying, I don't know what to do with this, but God, I know what your word says about this, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start walking in the way that leads to your promises. What would it look like? We've got to know the promises of God. Don't get stuck. Don't let your action be inaction. Don't be a person that you face something and you just say, I don't know what to do, so I'm not going to do anything. You look at the promises of God, and you look at that thing, and you look at that overwhelming circumstance in the light of the promises of God. Because here's what I can promise you. There is nothing that you are walking through that the Bible does not talk about. There is not one of you in here that you are going through something that the Bible does not deal with. The Bible doesn't talk about pornography. No, but it talks about lust. I don't know why I do that voice when I talk about pornography all the time. Like I feel like hey man, what's going on? That's the pornography voice forever. I don't know why. Like it talks about everything. The first thing that we see Jonathan do is Jonathan takes action. The second thing that we see is Jonathan has a bold faith. Jonathan has a bold faith. Listen, 1 Samuel 14:6. Let's go across to the outpost of those pagans, Jonathan said to his armor bearer. Perhaps the Lord will help us, for nothing can hinder the Lord. He can win a battle whether he has many warriors or only a few. So Jonathan, he's standing. He is looking at this outpost in verse 6. He sees the two cliffs. And I don't know if he can just see the fires. I don't know the distance of it. But he is in it where he says, let's go over to that Philistine outpost. He looks at the cliffs that he has to climb down, the cliffs that he has to climb up. He has no idea how many men he could be facing at all. And all that he goes off of is a perhaps. Perhaps. Perhaps the Lord will act on our behalf. Perhaps. Perhaps God will show up strong because God can cause us to win whether there's a ton of warriors or only a few warriors. Perhaps God will act on our behalf. Sub30, sometimes all you need is a perhaps. Sometimes all you need in those moments of the things that you face is a perhaps. Man, God, I don't know what you want me to do, and God, I don't know, but perhaps, God, you will show up. Perhaps, God, you will do what it is that only you can do. Perhaps, God, the choice that I make will be the choice that you've called me to, and you will show up. Sometimes all we need is a perhaps. One huge, faith-filled perhaps. So what's your overwhelming situation right now? What is that circumstance? What is that choice? What is that relationship? What is that thing that you're facing? Perhaps the Lord will act on your behalf. Perhaps. Perhaps he will show up strong, and the thing that you fear the most will not even be a concern. Perhaps you will get to the place that is so scary and so hard, and what you will realize is God has been calling you there the whole time. Perhaps the choice that you are so fearful of making is what God is going to use to put you in the place where he is calling you to. Perhaps. Listen, as followers of Jesus Christ, There are times where we need to put ourselves and be involved in things that are so big that if God doesn't show up, they're not going to work. As followers of Jesus Christ, we need to be involved in things, and we need to be a part of things that are so big and are so massive that if God does not show up and move, it's not going to work. Perhaps He will. Perhaps God will show up. Well, Josh, it's scary. It's scary to step out like that only on a perhaps. It's scary to step out and not really know, God, how are you going to show up? God, what are you going to do? I mean, God, Josh, it's scary to have that much trust in God. Then guess what? You do it afraid. You do it scared. You can't tell me for 1 second as Jonathan was climbing up and down those cliffs, not knowing what he was going to face, going off of a perhaps, that there wasn't like, he wasn't freaking out. You can't tell me that he wasn't scared. You can't tell me that he wasn't concerned, that he was a little bit nervous, that it wasn't going to work out, because all he was going off of was a perhaps. But what Jonathan knew was that his God was bigger than his fear, and all he needed was a perhaps that God would show up. Perhaps. See, I think we have this thing, we believe that when we step, how many of you have ever heard this? I'm just praying about it, just don't have a peace about it. You know what we have peace about? The things that we want to do. We have peace about the things that we want to do. You know, I prayed to God and I have a peace about sleeping with my girlfriend. I have a peace about that. You want to do that. That's why you have a peace about that. Do you think that when God told Peter, I want you to get out of the boat and walk to me, that Peter looked at the other disciples and said, hey guys, you know what? I have a peace about this. And he got out of the boat? We have a peace about the things that we want to do. So one of the things that we use to not follow God is we say, God, I know that you're calling me here, but God, I'm a little bit scared. I don't have a peace about it. You do it afraid. You do it afraid that if God has called you to it, He will sustain it. You do it afraid knowing that God and your faith and your Savior and your Jesus are bigger than any sort of fear that you could face. You do it afraid. Listen, I have followed Jesus and stepped out in faith a lot of times, and I'm in the midst of one right now. They're scary. They're hard, but just because there is some fear in it, just because there is some, I don't know how this is going to turn out, doesn't mean that God's not in it. There's some of you in here right now, you know that God is calling you to something. You know that God is calling you to step out. You know that God is messing with you and dealing with you. And the excuse that you have been using is, I just have some fear in me. I don't have a peace about it. Listen to me. You do it afraid. You do it afraid, and it's okay to say, God, I don't know how this is going to turn out. God, I feel like you are calling me to this, and God, this lines up with your promises in Scripture, but God, I'm still afraid, but God, I'm going to take a step. Perhaps, God, you're going to show up. What would it look like for you if tonight at the end of this service, whatever it is that you're facing, when you came to this altar, it was just this? Perhaps God's going to show up. For some of you in here, you've never come to the altar because you have just been skeptical of it. You've never come and asked for prayer. You've never come and met with a pastor. You've never walked out to connect, to get plugged in, because there's been this fear in you that people wouldn't like you, or that you would be rejected, or they're just like every other church. Perhaps the Lord will show up. Perhaps He will act on your behalf. For some of you, you've been afraid to step into a relationship, step out of a relationship, step into a job, step out of a job, get involved in church, because you've been afraid of the overwhelming circumstance, the overwhelming choice. Perhaps the Lord will act on your behalf. Do you know that God is for you more than you are for you? Do you know that he wants better for you than you can even dream of for yourself?